for this evening's program. Um, and thank you very much for coming, Merri-Lee, to introduce to us to a subject I know that I'm not familiar with, and although I am familiar with losing someone, I think this is really a wonderful opportunity this evening. So Merri-Lee talks to us in our thing about how her mother's dying journey in 2010 inspired her to become a death doula. I'm so curious about what this means that I'm going to allow Merri-Lee to introduce herself as she tells us about her journey, companioning the dying as a death doula. Merri-Lee?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure and honor to be here at your meeting tonight, and to speak about something that's obviously very dear to my heart. I do actually have some slides, so I will share them while I think. I'm really not technologically savvy, so are you seeing that?
Coming up.
It's coming up. Okay,
There it is.
there we go. Okay, so just need to. Okay, so you can see that?
Mhm. Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, um, so as you can see, I'm a death doula, a bereavement specialist, and a Reiki master. So I have my practice is called Soul Journeys Healing and Companioning, and I work primarily out of my home in Stevensville. I've been in practice about 10 years, actually. My business just turned 10 in January, so very proud of that. It's been an incredible journey. And, had you asked me in 2010 when my mom passed, what I would be doing in 15 years, I would not have thought it would be this. So it's really interesting, where life leads us. So, on that note, this is my mom, my inspiration. This is Sandy. And I'm here today because of her. For a few reasons. So certainly because I wouldn't be here if she didn't give birth to me, but also because um, I like to share a little bit about her, not only her death in 2010, but something really interesting is that she became pregnant with me in 1972 after her tubes had been tied for many years. So my siblings are actually 10, 12, and 15 years older than me. And so I was a miracle baby. But the thing about back then being pregnant, as I'm sure most of you here know, is that there was no ultrasounds and that sort of thing. So when she gave birth to me, when she went into labor, she had something called placenta accreta, which is where the placenta grows and attaches into the uterine wall. So as she was having contractions, she actually ended up bleeding out and she died giving birth to me. So what was fascinating about that was she had a near-death experience and she was clinically dead for, I believe, 7 minutes. So she should have been, if they revived her, should have been, had some brain damage and all of that, but she did not. So another miracle. But what was so fascinating about that was that when she came back, she talked about this experience she had. And she talked about where she went and what she saw and what it felt like and what it smelled like and just how the colors were so different. And every time she told that story, she had a look on her face like I've never seen from anyone until I became a death doula. So, fast forward to 2010, Mother's Day, actually. I had gone to pick her up for brunch. We always get together for brunch, all the mothers and daughters, and I had gone to pick her up for brunch. Now, she's someone that had had lung disease for a very long time. So long, in fact, that we didn't actually anticipate that she would die from that. Um, and when I went to pick her up that day, she seemed a little bit off. And when we got in the car and we were driving to brunch, she took my hand and she told me that the night before she'd gone to emerge because she went into distress with her breathing. And when she got there and they ran some tests, she was told that she had congestive heart failure and that she should get her affairs in order. So she asked me to do two things. The first thing was ask me if I would help her get her affairs in order. And the second thing was, don't tell anybody at brunch because we're going to meet with my sisters and all of our children. And, I was just like, wow. So we drove the rest of the way to brunch, just holding hands with quiet tears coming down our faces. And once we got through that day, then we went to work on doing the things she needed to do. So getting her affairs in order. She was very adamant that she wanted to die at home. She wanted to be, where she was comfortable, with her kids and her family around. And so that was, we went to work on making sure we could do that. She lived in Fort Erie, and she had a wonderful palliative care nurse who spent, I want to say, like, she would come about an hour every day, and she spent maybe 20% of the time doing nursing things and 80% of the time educating my mom and all of us on what to expect on the journey so that we didn't panic, so that we didn't call 911. So she helped to really eliminate that fear in order to keep mom at home. And, you know, we had a wonderful time. And because of that, we were able to keep her home. And she died 7 weeks and 2 days after Mother's Day on June the 29th. So, what was really, wonderful about all of that was that when she was actually dying, she wasn't afraid and we weren't afraid. And because of her previous experience, 37 years prior when I was born, she also didn't have fear about death because she knew where she was going. She had been there before. And I can tell you that in those last days and hours, as she seemed to drift between both worlds, she had that same look on her face that I had seen every time she told that story about her near-death experience. So it was very comforting. So, what I realized on my grief journey, because that was the biggest loss at that time in my life, was for sure my mom. I was 37 when she died. And, I don't think we're ever really ready to lose a parent, but I thought I was pretty young to lose my mom. And so, I went into deep grief and I wasn't actually in this realm yet. I had a completely different career at that time. And so I went to grief counseling because I was so lost. And, through that journey, I realized that that nurse that had been essentially a doula through that time helped immensely to set the foundation for our grief journey by allowing my mom to be at home and to die the way she wanted to. So that helped a lot. So anyway, at that time, I went back to school for bereavement education because I really wanted to help other people through that journey. I figured, there's going to be lots of people out there blindsided by their grief, and I want to help them. So that was kind of my first step in kind of changing paths. I was already a Reiki practitioner, but not really practicing. And so while I was going back to school for bereavement education, that's where I heard about this term death doula. And I'm like, what the heck is that? Like, it can also be interchanged with Thana doula. So Thana is the Greek word for death, and doula is the Greek word for helper. So that's where that comes from, Thana doula. And when I learned about that, I was like, wow, that's what that nurse was basically. I mean, I learned from my own experience with my mom that, dying really is like this much medical and this much natural, right? Like healthcare has a very small place in death. We know how to be born and we know how to die. And so it was really fascinating. So once I completed my bereavement education, I sought out death doula training and I took that, and it was really wonderful. And I have to say that, we give so much. Actually, I'm going to change the slide here. Um, we give so much time and attention to creating a birth plan and to all the care and everything around, having a baby. But we don't do that as much with dying, right? It's like there's a lot of fear around death. Obviously, we live in a very death phobic or death denying society. And even though, being born and dying are the two things that we all have in common, we don't really talk about it as much. So, because of that, there can be fear and all of that. So, um, it's kind of interesting through all of that training too. I was reminded that, before like Western medicine was really big, before there was hospitals and before there were funeral homes, people were born at home and they died at home. And when that happened, families took part in all of that, right? So, it wasn't uncommon to have children as part of, in the room when their siblings were being born or helping with different things. And it was also not uncommon to have them also present with dying. Funerals used to be held in the home, right? That's why there was a room called the parlor. And so it was really fascinating to realize like that's how it just was. And then with as we became more progressive, as we had hospitals and funeral homes, we put dying and death into those places, and we created some fear around that inadvertently by hiding it away. So it's not as mainstream, if you will, in a home. um, which is also interesting because most people do want to die at home. Most people don't want to die in a hospital. Hospices are great, but most people do actually want to die at home. Um, so again, going back to the doula piece, it was like, all right, we have something called a birth doula. So a birth doula helps to, kind of help create that birth plan. They help with all of the, not the physical so much, but the mental, emotional, and spiritual care of a woman who's pregnant and anticipating a birth. So if we take that same care and bring it to the opposite end of life, to dying, then we have what's called a death doula who helps to do those same things too. So all of that said, um, so a death doula is, known as a death companion or post-death supporter, a non-medical person, because we are non-medical, who assists people before, during, and after death, as well as their family and loved ones by providing education, guidance, support, physical assistance, and emotional support. And what does that mean really? So what our role is overall is like we bring empathy, compassion, and support to, the dying person and their loved one. Um, ones, sorry. We support all relationships with the dying person at the center. So my client is always like number one, and then their loved ones kind of go out from there. But I am there to support all of them, with them being my priority. We can provide spiritual care and grief support. So, as you can imagine, grief is always very present. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but grief is present all the way along for both the person that's dying and their loved ones. Spiritual care that can be simply conversations around what their belief system is, that sort of thing. I have certainly found that folks who believe that there's something after this have an easier time with their dying, rather than folks who are either agnostic or atheist. They seem to struggle a little bit more with where they're going to go and what's going to happen, because they seem to think they just stop existing, and what was it all for? So there can be a lot more care needed there. Um, so I serve the dying and their loved ones. I fill in the gaps of care wherever they call home. So, generally that is their home. Um, and if it is a long-term care home or something like that, because there are those places, then again, filling in gaps. So not trying to get in the way of anything. Certainly don't get in the way of the medical team, that sort of thing. But just wherever they feel like they need help, whether it's respite or errands or things like that. We can also like bring dying and death back to community, meaning that, we talk about it. So we talk about it and we help make it happen, because, if someone has a loved one who's dying and they're like, I just don't even know where to start, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to put them in the hospital, that sort of thing. Then that's what they end up doing, even though it's not necessarily the right thing. It's not what the person wants. So, we can help keep them in their homes through education. There's a lot of education. We create and facilitate open conversations, and that means, around what different people's options are. So based on their diagnosis, based on their prognosis, what they want their dying to look like. Often people who are dying haven't really thought about it before. So now they have all of these, these big decisions to make and these big questions, and most people don't even know what their options are. Um, so what does that look like? Some people don't even realize they can die at home. They think they have to go to a hospital. So, just kind of helping them to understand based on what kind of level of support they have, based on what's available in their community, and based on what their wishes are. And then creating awareness of dying and death. And that's through often things called death cafes, which I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with that, but um, I can speak a little bit more about those later. But it's again kind of creating an open conversation, kind of like this, specific to dying and death, and just people bring their thoughts, their feelings, their fears, their beliefs around what happens when we die, and it's a really lovely evening of open conversation. And then so what I offer as a doula, so ideally it's wonderful to come in early on the journey. So someone receives a diagnosis, they have no idea where to start. Let's call a doula because she can help us, he or she can help us. So with advanced care planning, sadly, a lot of folks don't have this stuff done ahead of time. It's interesting because just like talking about babies won't get you pregnant, talking about death won't kill you. So I always joke about that because it's true. If we plan for these sorts of things when we're healthy, it's not as difficult to do because when someone receives a diagnosis and suddenly they have to plan their funeral, um, think about like all of those things. Do I want to be buried? Do I want to be cremated? Do I want to have like, do I want to be in a mausoleum? Do I want to be in a niche? Do I want to be on the mantle? All of these things are so much easier to talk about when there's no diagnosis. But when there is, it's so much more real. That said, I created my first advanced care plan probably about 8 or 9 years ago. I've changed it 3 or 4 times. I still don't have a diagnosis, but life changes. So, it's a way to lean into our mortality, to think about what our options are, and to kind of consider all of that. It's a great way to have conversations with our spouses, with our kids. I can't tell you how many times, in my bereavement practice where people struggle with guilt because they don't know what their loved one wanted and they made all these decisions and then they have regrets because, well, now I don't know if they would have wanted that. So when we lay all of these things out for our loved ones, it's actually a gift, right? So with advanced care planning, it's all of that stuff. You have a substitute decision maker, which is someone who makes decisions on your behalf if you can't. You get your wills and powers of attorney done, and have these open conversations about what your wishes are. Legacy work that is capturing a life, basically. A lot of us, I mean, it was wonderful listening to you ladies go around earlier and talk about, what you do, what you've done, and your wins. I love hearing about wins, particularly in the way the world is nowadays when it just feels like there's nowhere to turn. But, you know, oftentimes when someone's dying, they feel like, my goodness, I haven't even done anything with my life. So with legacy work, it can be just, me having a conversation. Tell me about your life. Tell me about what your childhood was like. Where did you grow up? How was school for you? What was your passion? What did you go to college for? What did you do, for work and things like that? And when people do that, when they have the opportunity to chat about their lives, they realize they actually accomplished a lot more than they thought they did. So that can be part of it. Sometimes legacy work looks like putting albums together, which is actually a really dying art because how often do we actually print pictures nowadays? They're all in our phones. I think I have like 7 or 8 thousand photos in my phone. And, I don't even know when's the last time I printed one, but it's lovely to be able to print baby pictures and then, all the way up through the person's life, maybe wedding photos, maybe when they have their children, that sort of thing. And it's like literally capturing their whole life. It can also be, I have these, I call them legacy work interview questions where I actually interview them about their life and then we create a story. Um, I had a client probably about, I think it was 2018. She was in her late 30s. She had two young children. Her oldest one was 12, and I think her daughter was 9. And And something that was really important to her was we wrote out a bunch of cards. So birthday cards, Christmas cards, things like that that their dad could give to them on holidays as they grew up. Milestones like graduation. It was really important to her to buy a necklace for her daughter for her wedding day. Um, Things like that, cufflinks for her son for his wedding day. So, that's a way that people can live on in their children's lives after they pass or their grandchildren. So that's what legacy work can look like. We can also offer complementary therapies. So again, I am a Reiki practitioner, so I often do Reiki with my clients. I also offer palliative massage. Um, so, for folks who have had ALS clients, I do a lot of palliative massage for them. Folks who have had breast cancer and such that struggle with lymphedema, lots of massage there. So you can offer complementary therapies. Some people might do, I heard aromatherapy, there's acupressure, reflexology. So if you're certified in those as a doula, you can also offer those to clients. Vigil planning. So what vigil planning is basically the last days and hours of someone's life. So let's say they want to die at home. What room do they want to be in? What do they want to be happening? Do they want to have music playing? Do they want to have nature sounds? Do they want to be facing outside to the backyard where they can see, their garden? Who do they want to be there? Do they want anybody to be reading to them? Do they want poetry or anything that's meaningful for them? So, kind of what do they want their vigil to look like? And then creating a vigil plan, basically, or a schedule, sorry. So, like, let's say there's 3 hour shifts or 4 hour shifts, if the person's like, I don't want to be alone. So then who's going to be there at what time? And often, doulas can fill in through the night in that instance. So people are getting proper sleep at night as well. So that's something. And then, of course, grief support, because grief is, woven through the whole journey. It's literally right from diagnosis, which I believe is my next slide. Yeah. So grief begins at diagnosis for the dying person and their loved ones. And, I often say that there are many deaths along a dying journey because once someone receives a diagnosis, suddenly everything changes. Let's just say, they have treatment that's recommended. So now maybe they're off work, right? So now they've lost their meaning. Oftentimes we get a lot of meaning from our careers. I heard that around the screen tonight, which is really lovely. So and then you've got your work family, let's say, and then you're not seeing them. Maybe you're not able to, the treatment's making you sick and you're not able to participate in life the way you did before, whether it's socially or, even being able to take out the garbage because you're too tired. Um, just not being able to participate in meals the same way. There's so many things that can change. Not to mention, people can fall away. Oftentimes when someone receives a diagnosis, people don't know what to say, so they don't say anything, which can be hard, right? So then, there's a sense of isolation there can be, and it's tough. So again, a lot of what I do is grief work, right from diagnosis through, um, again, with the dying person at the center, but also their loved ones. And a lot of it too for me is normalizing their experience because, you know, everybody that's going through it thinks that nobody else understands what they've gone through and that they're the only person that's gone through this. And even though they know that's not the case, it can really feel like that. So a lot of what I do on the journey is normalizing that experience for them. So as we know, grief is a natural response to any type of loss, but it's even present like in our everyday. We don't really talk about it as much. Mind you, I feel like it's starting to be talked about more now, but aging, there's a lot of grief around aging. And that's in our everyday, retirement people. I heard that there's retired folks here, although you all seem to be keeping yourselves pretty busy too, which is wonderful. I've yet to meet a retired person that can't figure out, like they can't figure out how they had time to work before. They always say that, and I get such a kick out of that. I look forward to that myself one day. Um, so, oftentimes, grief is related to death, but again, it begins at diagnosis. So anticipatory grief is what that is. So someone's anticipating that their life is going to end. They're anticipating all of the losses on the journey. They're anticipating leaving their family, their friends, and that sort of thing. So that can be really hard. And it happens not just for the dying person, but for their loved ones, anticipating what life might look like without their loved one. Complicated grief, that's where, and this happens a lot nowadays. We have a lot of blended families. There can be a lot of complications in that. Or, people that are estranged and then, someone's dying and suddenly they show up and they want to be part of it. That can be complicated. Multiple losses, that sort of thing. And then disenfranchised grief is basically where someone's grief is not acknowledged. So this can be very prevalent also with MAID or medical assistance in dying, because if people are open to talking about how that's what the person's going to choose or what they did choose and they've passed now, but a lot of people still keep that pretty quiet because there can be religious reasons for not sharing it. There can be just the concern about guilt or shame or stigma, that sort of thing. So I'm finding still that a lot of people, while there's a lot of people that are saying, nope, that's what I'm choosing, that's what I want to do, I don't want to suffer, and they're really strong in that conviction, there's as many people that are like, I'm not going to advertise it, I just want to do it peacefully. And they also don't want other people to know, so then their loved ones aren't supposed to share, which then can disenfranchise that part of their grief. So their loved one still died, but they can't share the circumstances of it. And, one thing that I've really learned is that we need to have our grief witnessed, whatever that looks like. That's called mourning. So that's the outward expression of grief. And when we don't have that witnessing of our grief, it can be harder to navigate it because we feel more isolated and alone in it. So those are some types of grief and kind of what I come up against or, walk alongside. I shouldn't say come up against, but walk alongside on this journey with clients. Um, and another thing that's very prevalent in dying is judgment. So, I have this expression where I say, don't should on me and I won't should on you because should is a judgment, right? So people are like, well, I should do this treatment or I should do that treatment or I should try this or I should try that or or worse, their loved ones are saying you should do this, you should do that. But nobody knows what it's like to be that person who has the diagnosis except that person, right? So, with my mom, for instance, there was no treatment, but then my husband passed about 2 years ago, well, almost 3 years ago now. He went through treatment on and off for 5 years. And I'm telling you, when we got there's nothing more you can do, but there's nothing more we can do for you, he had he found so much freedom in that statement because he was going through treatment after treatment after treatment after surgery after procedure for his kids, for everybody that loved him. And he did want to live, obviously, but when it got to that point, he found so much relief in that because nobody could say should anymore. And he couldn't even say it to himself. So there can be a lot of judgment in a journey like this. So again, I listen, I take it in, I notice what's going on, I make suggestions, and kind of help massage these relationships and these conversations, and give people permission to feel how they feel and to talk about it with each other because communication is like, as I think we all know, it's the foundation of every good relationship, and it's really, really important on a dying journey. There's so many beautiful, meaningful conversations that can and should happen. There, I'm just using the word should um, on an end of life journey that help loved ones further down the road, and also help the person who's dying. To be able to talk about all of these things and to be able to share honestly and openly how everyone's feeling is so healing to be able to do that. And then, of course, I always say to the dying person, stop shitting on yourself because, you need to be kind to yourself, have compassion for yourself. Dying is hard work. It is hard work. It's, not so much maybe about, the medical aspect or treatment or that sort of thing, but just even knowing that, your time on this earth is coming to an end. And often people have like, there's so many things that they still wanted to do. I hear that all the time. So that's why, in the beginning of the journey, if I can come in early enough, I'll say, what are some things that you really want to do while you can? Kind of like a bucket list. And I highly encourage bucket lists because just because you create one, again, doesn't mean as soon as you check it off, everything off, you're going to die. You keep adding to it, and maybe you take something off, right? Like maybe you're just, I don't want to jump out of a plane anymore. I'm past that. So I take that off and I'm going to add something else. But it's funny because some folks actually think, my gosh, if I make a bucket list and I check it all off, I guess that means I'm ready to die. No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that you add more things. So, I think that's really all I was going to share. Yeah. So that's my business there, souljourneyshealing.ca. And I've got a website there. There's more information there. And then I'm just happy to stop sharing and take any questions if anybody has any.
Charmaine, would you like to say a few words?
Well, first I wanted to say, wow, thank you very much. But let's see if there are any questions first,
Yes.
and then we will do a good thank you then. We're
The recording. This makes it easier for people to ask questions.